Pope Francis abolished the pontifical secret in an effort to make the Church more transparent when investigating cases of sexual abuse. Now, this essentially gives civil authorities access to documents and testimony in these particular cases that were previously sealed. Will this move achieve the transparency Pope Francis desires? And is it fair to victims and the accused? Here with analysis, plus a look back on the big stories of 2019 and my choice for the World Over Person of the Year. I'm joined by the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of TheCatholicThing.org, Robert Royal, here with me in Washington, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, who joins us from Manhattan. Gentlemen, glad we can take one final ride before we move into 2020. I want to start with the laicization of Theodore McCarrick, which was the big story to come out of the Vatican in early 2019. 5 days before the start of the Sex Abuse Summit in February, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis had expelled Theodore McCarrick from the priesthood after the Church found him guilty of sexually abusing minors and adult seminarians over decades. The Vatican has yet to release a report on the findings of the McCarrick investigation. Now, several American bishops met with Pope Francis this week and over the last few months. They say to expect a report sometime at the beginning of the next year. Do you, Father Jerry, expect any new information or surprises to be revealed about McCarrick?
Raymond, I think there will be surprises. Certainly there'll be new information because this study is based on the archives, meaning the files, the documents that they have on file in the different Vatican departments. So depending on what documents are revealed, I think we're going to learn things that we did not know. We'll also have an opportunity to compare what is released by the Vatican with what we already know from the assertions by Archbishop Vigano, and then also the revelations by Father Boniface Ramsey and Monsignor Anthony Figueiredo, all of whom knew McCarrick, had dealings with him, and then brought to the fore that, in fact, McCarrick's situation had been made known to Rome years before.
Now, Bob, there is a tension here. I mean, there are high stakes involved in this kind of report. Do you think we're going to learn the individuals that propelled McCarrick and kept him in power for so long?
Well, I'm hopeful that Father Murray is hopeful. When he's hopeful, it makes me even more optimistic than I might normally be.
Well, you're both more optimistic than I am then. Go ahead.
But I'm doubtful about that. I think we're going to see a lot of emphasis on what happened in the past that enabled McCarrick to pass through this course of honors where he just went from being a bishop and then up and up and up to become Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, and then the most influential prelate, I think, in the United States, we could say at a certain point. I think what a lot of people are more interested in knowing right now, I mean, that is all very interesting and needs to be brought out because we need to deal with that sort of thing and make sure it doesn't happen again. But I think what a lot of people would like to know, too, is why McCarrick came back from the dead, so to speak, in about 2013. I mean, it's simply the case that Archbishop Vigano himself broke the seal of the pontifical secret because he said the pontifical secret was not intended to hide crimes, that he felt it was necessary for him to speak out because there were crimes being concealed under this sort of ruling. So I'm quite skeptical that we're going to see things that are relevant to the most recent difficulties. Why was McCarrick going to China? What was he involved with there? Why was he seemingly rehabilitated in some fashion or other?
And still had access to a lot of money.
Yeah.
He was trying to pick the pockets of the Papal Foundation and other places, which, let's face it, funded his propulsion up the ladder in Rome and kept him in power and kept him in good stead in the halls of power.
As we've seen with other figures around the Holy Father who have had abuse questions raised, and as we've seen in some of the financial scandals, as you start to get close to people who are actually in power right now in Rome, it seems you hit a brick wall.
Yeah. The Sex Abuse Summit was held in Rome from February 21st to the 24th of this year. It was to look at the protection of minors and vulnerable adults, but it became clear early on that this meeting was not going to include the protection of vulnerable adults and therefore did not cover the sexual abuse of seminarians. Now, this is Archbishop Scicluna and Cardinal Cupich on that focus.
The prudence that you need in confronting sexual abuse of minors will also serve you in confronting other types of misconduct.
Those other issues of misbehavior on the part of clerics with vulnerable adults or other adults are topics that need addressing. But we are focusing in these days on those who have so little voice. Young people, minors, don't have a voice, and they are kept in silence.
So the translation is they didn't hear about abuse of vulnerable adults. How big an omission was this at this summit to ignore the predation on seminarians and young men, Father Jerry?
Well, it certainly is a topic that should be studied at the Vatican. Whether to do it at that moment was the right thing, that's debatable. But I will point out that in the new law that Pope Francis issued in May of this year, Vos Estis, they do talk about crimes committed by ecclesiastics against vulnerable adults, and that would include seminarians. In addition, that law dealt with the cover-up of ecclesiastical crimes involving sex abuse by religious superiors, meaning bishops and then heads of religious orders. So that was a great step in progress in actually putting into precise terminology the ecclesiastical crime of covering up. And they also made it easier to report to Vatican authorities, either to the nuncio or directly to the Roman congregation, when suspicion is present that a superior, such as a bishop, is covering something up. So there is progress that has been made since that meeting in the Vatican, but I would say at the time there was a lot of dissatisfaction because there were a lot of generalities, but there were actually, it wasn't clear where it was going at that point.
Now, Father Jerry, you wrote a piece on those new norms, and you noted that it doesn't establish clear penalties for abusers and bishops complicit in these cover-ups, What can the American bishops do about that?
Well, this is the law develops, by the practice of the Roman Curia, so how they deal with the penalties. Now, one of the things that we have is the case of Buffalo, where the bishop there, Bishop Malone, was accused of covering up sex abuse that was going on in his diocese. And instead of invoking Vos Estis, this new law, which required an examination of the case according to these new norms, the Pope sent an apostolic visitator, that was Bishop DiMarzio of Brooklyn, and within a few weeks of the completion of that visit, Bishop Malone's retirement was accepted. So it was a little bit strange, and that was noted by commentators, that a case that clearly fit in with the new law was instead handled in an alternate manner. Let's see as the next complaint comes forward. We already know that there's a complaint out in Minnesota that's been lodged with the Holy See regarding another bishop. Let's see how that plays out. But I'm encouraged that there is progress in addressing not simply the horrible crime of sex abuse by priests, but also the enabling crime of protecting or covering up those by bishops and religious superiors.
Bob, the Pope is getting a lot of good press this week because of eliminating this pontifical secret, which was created by Pope Benedict, if I'm not incorrect, and when it deals with cases of sexual abuse. My question is, when Vatican officials say this is a sign of transparency and cooperation with civil authorities, is it in practice?
Well, it's a step forward insofar as it means you can't use this as an excuse any longer not to turn over documents or whatever. But there still is the case, as many people have pointed out, that there still is going to be the question of responsibility, when these things are actually going to be reported somewhere. And I don't handle these cases. I mean, obviously, Father Murray has. There still is going to be a question of discretion, because we've all seen cases in which people have been wrongly accused. Someone is trying to get revenge on a priest or a bishop that they don't like. There needs to be also the discretion to protect people who are innocent from simply wild charges. But this is a step forward. And I have to say that I was in Rome when the February summit took place, and that that event when Cardinal Supich and Archbishop Scicluna were speaking, people were laughing in the room because they were being put on the spot, and there's this kind of lawyerly approach. Well, we're only doing the most vulnerable right now. And then a woman reporter said to Scicluna, Cardinal McCarrick stood in this very room and told us 10 years ago that we were going to get to the bottom of this. And you're telling us that this is going to be delayed further. So, look, it's a step forward, but you still get the sense that there's some foot dragging here, that they don't really want to get to some of the more sensitive cases that might be out there. But we'll see as this develops how much that's
well, and there, as we've said on this show repeatedly, there are also some very high-profile cases of people working at the Vatican, very close to the upper echelons of power there, who have, for whatever reason, been shielded, protected, and they somehow don't get the full accounting, and we don't get justice in those situations. But maybe this is moving closer. We'll see. Pope Francis appointed a fellow Jesuit, Father Juan Antonio Guerrero Alves, to be the Vatican's finance minister. Now, he's filling that crucial position left vacant for more than 2 years by Cardinal George Pell when he left Rome to stand trial on his sex abuse charges in his native Australia. Father Jerry, your thoughts on the choice and timing of this appointment, a Jesuit with no extensive financial experience, going in and overseeing what, you know, is a nightmare, which we'll get to in a moment.
Well, he's got a big challenge, and I don't know the man, and I'm sure he, you know, is a man who's obviously shown that he has accomplishments that drew his name to the Pope's attention. I can say this, to go from a cardinal with international stature, Pell, to a relatively unknown priest, that's not exactly a confidence-building move by comparison in the secular world. If you had, you know, the head of corporate finance at a big corporation being replaced by, you know, in essence, a branch manager who had limited exposure to the overall operations. So, you know, the Pope has his reasons, and I don't know this man and his qualifications aside from reading his resume in the newspapers. So I wish him well, but the way things work in the Vatican often is cardinals only pick up the phone when there's a problem if it comes from another cardinal. So let's see if this man can assert himself in this situation.
Now, Bob, this comes in the wake of a string of financial scandals this past year. A $110 million Vatican loan on this speculative London property, a $50 million loan to bail out an Italian hospital, and then there was the Peters Pence story that broke late this year, that only 10% of the $55 million raised, and at least in the advertising of this campaign, it's always to help the poor, only 10% of that money actually goes to the poor. Where do we go from here, and why should people feel confident in giving to the church?
Well, I don't think they should feel confident. I think they should be very careful where they put their money. I know I myself have, my wife and I have made certain decisions about where we give.
Recalibrated your giving.
Recalibrated our giving. Look, one of the things we know for sure, that just as in the cases of sexual abuse, when they rise to the level of various figures inside the Vatican, some very close to the Holy Father, some personal friends. Every time somebody gets close, or seems to be getting close, to these financial problems, which seem eminently solvable. This poor Jesuit who's being brought in does seem to have had some experience running some Jesuit province in Spain or something, but not at this level. I mean, what you need at this level, as Father rightly says, is not only a cardinal who can navigate the prelates within the Vatican. You need serious financial knowledge. This is not rocket science. It's very simple to set up an organization. In fact, it seems to me that will monitor investments, that will not allow the Vatican to invest in a movie about Elton John and his gay lifestyle and his anti-Christian points of view. I mean, these are very simple steps that can be put in place if there's a will to do it.
But it's not so simple in this ecosystem. And as you know, and Father Jerry, you're talking about layers upon layers, decades of practices that when you bring a guy like Pell, and let's be honest, part of the reason George Pell was targeted and hated by the old guard in the Vatican is because he was turning up those stones and exposing people who had these honey, little honey pots all over the place where they were picking and using money for their own lifestyles and their own choices. This is a problem. And in a year when we've seen the Vatican regulator resign, because he was so outraged. The head of the Vatican Bank walked out the door because they claim he was spying on other people. He was probably trying to get to the bottom of this too. How do you clean this up, Father Jerry? How does a novice Jesuit walk in the door and clean up this kind of decades-long corruption, probably centuries corruption?
Well, when you have financial scandals in corporate America or in government, the only way that you restore confidence is by coming clean with a full story. And that often happens in courts because people get sued and, Enron and all these other type cases that we know of. I think the Vatican has to, modernize its approach in a way that would require lay participation at the level of investment review committees and with clear public standards about where money will be invested. There should be a vetting process for any Vatican money manager, that he have no known criminal associations, that he not be involved in institutions which themselves have been either criminally investigated or, in fact, just suspended because of bad dealings. The whole thing here gets down to accountability in the sight of those who are providing the funds, and that is the laity of the Catholic Church. It's amazing, for instance, when you read these stories, that investments are made with money managers and in projects that are particularly known to certain ecclesiastics, but otherwise have no profile at all in world economic, the world economy. As somebody wrote in one commentary, when you're investing money, what about J.P. Morgan? Why aren't major banks who have, all kinds of level of government scrutiny in the United States or elsewhere, why aren't they the ones managing the money? Now, for all we know, most of the money could be with a place like that. But we really need accountability, and the Vatican is a sovereign state, but the sovereignty of the state is to be at the service of the mission. The mission of the Church is not served by financial dealings that are obviously dishonest or that involve corrupt people who are friends with those who hired them. So that has to be really cleaned up fast.
Well, and Bob, the exposure of those individuals is critical here because they don't want to be exposed. So they stop the internal audit. When you get Price Waterhouse coming in, suddenly up through the chain of the State Department to the Holy Father, they say, we're not doing that Price Waterhouse audit anymore. Why not? And isn't that why we're here? Very quickly, we only have 10 minutes.
Look, a friend of mine, Ettore Gozzi Tedeschi, is a former president of the Vatican Bank. And he and I were having lunch one time in Rome a couple of years ago after he'd been dismissed from his post for no cause that we can identify. And he said to me, Father said, you have to identify the different properties and whatnot. Well, he said to me, the Vatican does not know even what it owns. It has some idea of what it owns. And I said, like what? And he said, well, like the building we're sitting in right now in this restaurant, I think is owned by the Vatican. I said, you think it's owned? He said, yes, no one really has an inventory of this sort of thing. I mean, look, if you're even going to get serious about saying, let alone doing, that you're going to do a financial cleanup, you've got to look outside. I don't think it's going to ever be cleaned up from the inside, because we see every time somebody gets close to probably the malefactors, that person ends up off the scene.
Yep. Yeah. And George Pell probably got closest to reform here. True reform. The Vatican-China deal, which was signed in September of 2018, has been discussed many times this year as religious freedom has continued to deteriorate in China. The Catholics of that country are suffering more than they ever were before the deal was signed. Churches continue to be demolished, priests and laity are constantly threatened, and bishops are now on the run. Father Jerry, why are we not hearing anything from the Vatican? No condemnation for what's happening to bishops, to priests, to laity, and they seem to have no objection or even problem with the religious and human rights offenses we're seeing reported every day in the media.
Well, this is an area of grave concern to me and to many, many people, because when certain governments engage in practices to regulate immigration, illegal immigration into their countries, the Vatican is swift and condemnatory. When Chinese communist government officials tear down churches, issue laws prohibiting religious education for children, coerce priests into joining the Patriotic Association, when all of those things happen, the Vatican, as you say, is quiet. Cardinal Zen, who is the retired Cardinal of Hong Kong, has used very strong language. And I endorse him because I think he's telling the truth. He says the Chinese Catholics feel betrayed. And I scratch my head and I say, what is going on here Well, we don't really know everything because the Vatican entered into a deal with the Chinese Communist government without ever publishing the deal. We don't have any idea of what's in that deal. The Vatican should basically say to us, this is what we agreed to, and then defend it. Instead, they simply say, we agreed to something and now we're going to take action. I mean, the Vatican required bishops who were, in fact, in communion with Rome previously to cede their place to bishops who were part of this dissident, really schismatic organization.
Run by the
bishops
government.
who had been ordained. Yeah, bishops ordained without papal mandate and therefore automatically excommunicated. They were regularized overnight. This isn't right. Let's just say the real truth here. It seems that there's a desire to be cozy with the communists in order to get goodwill from them, and hopefully that'll produce some kind of public manifestation of friendship with the Vatican. It seems that that's more important than actually defending the rights of the Church. For instance, why does the Chinese government have a say in who becomes a Catholic bishop? Can you imagine if Donald Trump sent a note to the Vatican saying, you know, I want to name the next Archbishop of Philadelphia. Can I have some rights over that? The Vatican would laugh at him. Well, they should have laughed at the communists for the same thing.
Yeah. Pelosi would have impeached him again. I want to move on to this. I've got to. I'm almost out of time. The Synod on the Amazon took place in October. This, of course, was a huge story. You both were there. We covered this extensively. They recommended and proposed ordaining married men and requested a female diaconate. Now, long-term, Bob, what is the impact of this Synod substantively?
Well, it's very strange that this problem that exists in the Amazon, that could have been dealt with in the Amazon, and it could have been dealt with a synod in the Amazon, was actually brought to Rome, as was Pachamama, by the way, along the way, and made into what? An international event, so that people could use this admittedly difficult situation in the Amazon for what? I think clearly to reshape the universal church, because if deaconesses are going to be allowed, and if married priests are going to be allowed in the jungles of the Amazon, well, why not in other places where there's a shortage of clergy and of other church workers? Why not in Germany, where there are not many other ordinations or vocations? So I think that it's very clear that this was not intended solely to focus on one region in the church, but to begin a paradigm. And several of the bishops involved actually said it, that this is going to become a paradigm for the universal church.
We'll see. Well, while we're talking about the Amazon Synod, I want you all to react to this. I'd like to name the world over Person of the Year. Now, in this case, it's not exactly a person, but this is an individual, an entity that certainly made a splash this year and had an enormous impact on the church, overshadowed this entire synod, and I'm talking, of course, about Pachamama, those wooden idols that were venerated at the Amazon Synod. They became a symbol of the synod and set off headlines around the world. Let's hope she doesn't make it into the running next year. Father Jerry, your reaction to this whole Pachamama scandal. You had that Austrian young man who grabbed it and tossed it into the Tiber. The Pope later apologized for that. Does that have any long-term impact? It certainly scandalized a lot of Catholics around the world.
Well, the visual image that most people have of the Synod began in the Vatican Gardens even before the Synod opened, where they had a ceremony of a tree planting, and the Pachamama statue was on the lawn there, and people formed a circle and then bowed in prostration before this statue. Then later on, the statue was carried into St. Peter's. The statue was put into the Synod Hall. It was also put into a church on the street leading up to the Vatican. In other words, an idol became the focus of attention for many people at this synod, and this was done with the approval of the Catholic Church authorities. That young man who threw it into the water had a prophetic action. It's like, you know, Elijah in the Old Testament. You do actions which speak louder than any words. Idolatry is a horrible sin. It's a violation of the first commandment. It is not a joke. Idolatry is not a cultural artifact. It is an anti-cultural imposition, and, you know, the tradition of the church is idolatry is devil worship. We should have nothing to do with idols. Idols should not be present, and encouraging or letting people, you know, prostrate themselves in front of an idol in the Vatican garden. This is unbelievable.
Bob,
and I know this was said by many people, but
Yeah.
this has to end. This should never occur again.
Bob, the Pope apologized for this. He said there was no intention to worship idols or venerate these idols. And as Bishop of Rome, he apologized to those who were offended.
Yeah, but in point of fact, there were prayers said to this image. And Father is exactly right. Whether there was an intention that there be idolatry or not, there was functional. There was a functional type of idolatry, I think we have to say. Look, Pachamama is not a goddess. So what is she? There was no one who was willing to say at the Synod, why is this image there? Yeah. Why are people bowing down to it? Every time that those of us in the press would try to press somebody about what is this, they would tell us that there are all sorts of symbolic ways of representing this and that in different cultures of the world.
It's an earth mother, it's fertility, it represents fertility, but it's an entity that is worshipped.
But the long and the short of this is, for many people, it seemed to attract the type of activity, the type of obeisance that you pay toward a god or a goddess. And so there's just simply no way to say either that this was trivial. If it was trivial, then of course why are people bowing down to it? If it's not trivial, of course, then that's a very serious thing that it appeared on Vatican territory.
I have 2 minutes left. I'm going to give each of you a minute to give me your prognostications, your predictions about 2020. Father Jerry, I'll start with you.
My prognostication is, the faith will continue to be strong among those, among the laity and the clergy who, profess the faith that we were taught as children and love and cherish. On the other hand, the faith is also under attack, sad to say, by some leaders. We have the German bishops as a body, not all of them, but as a body, they're convoking a meeting, they're calling it the Synodal Way, and they are going to ask for things like the ordination of women. Which is completely impossible and antithetical to the Catholic doctrine of the priesthood. We also are going to see a major effort by people in the Church who think that homosexual activity is not sinful. They are going to try to convince us that that point of view is compatible with Catholic doctrine. This is a horrendous thing for them to do. It is offensive to the faith that they profess. You cannot say that homosexual activity is moral. If you do that, you're denying the truth of the Catholic faith. Unfortunately, this is coming down the pipe. We are seeing all kinds of efforts in this regard. I'm looking basically at two things: a faithful and inspired group, and then another group is trying to undermine the faith.
Robert Royal, your predictions.
Well, what we can already see is that the Holy Father has decided to bring together different groups of people. There will be in March a meeting about a kind of a global humanism, which is very bizarre. It sort of plays into this interreligious dialogue that he's been pushing with Muslims and with others. And it is very strange because very early on in his papacy, he told people that they ought to read Robert Hugh Benson's book, Lord of the World, which precisely warns against this sort of secular savior type figure who's going to reconcile everyone about things that cannot be reconciled. People have different views of what human beings are, and so this idea of humanism, I don't think, is going to go very far. There are also plans about ramping up a different view of economics, which is going to play into the global economy, global ecology type of thing that we've seen in the past. So I predict that we're going to see more of this sort of universalism coming out of the Vatican, and as we've seen politically around the world, in the UK and Brexit, here in the United States, places on the European continent, there's going to be a pushback, I believe, a Catholic pushback against what seems to me to be a very cavalier attitude about Catholic theology and Catholic practice.
Papal Posse, we will leave it there. Thank you both. Robert Royal, Father Jerry Murray, Merry Christmas to you both. We will see you in the new year, and you can read all of Robert Royal and Father Jerry's commentary at TheCatholicThing.org.